A couple of years, all you've heard about is these 5 countries, more commonly known as the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But recently, a lot of them have had major problems. Brazil, for example, there's a huge concern it's going to become the next Greece with having to put on both a World Cup and the Olympics. Russia has constant problems about having another industry beside oil. India struggles with both corruption and their bank facing a downgrade. China has major manufacturing issues. And South Africa, there's sort of debate of whether they should even be included on this list. So now Goldman Sachs has a new acronym, MIST, which is Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey. The major issue with these countries, though, is whether they can get over what's referred to as the middle class cliff, which is, can you develop an upper class of people who start from the bottom and work their way up? And right now, there's a huge doubt of whether that can happen. Which leads us to what I'm going to talk about, Myanmar. Now, Myanmar right now is pretty much a disaster for a variety of reasons, both economically and politically, but with opening up, there's potential. And that potential is what I'm going to go over today. And it's really influenced by these 3 people in particular. Aung San Suu Kyi, has anyone seen The Lady? Okay, one person. So Aung San Suu Kyi is the star of The Lady, is really considered almost the Mother Teresa, the lady of Myanmar, for what her father did, and has won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. Tien Sen is an ex-general who's more or less forced the corrupt government to dissolve and has now tried to open up the country. And then obviously, Barack Obama's visit there is very influential, and it really shows a shift in U.S. policy, which could really bring in a lot of new money. So what I'm going to cover today is a brief introduction to Myanmar, a little bit of the history and how it got to where it is today, what natural resources are rumored to exist, and then what is worth actually pursuing. So how I became interested in this topic is last year I traveled to Burma for probably about a week and a half, and I went to Mandalay, which is the economic center, Bagan, which is the equivalent of Angkor Wat of Cambodia, except in Myanmar, and then finally Yangon, which you saw President Obama at in the previous picture. So colonial Burma was founded in 1860. Before that, it was just a large conglomerate of city-states, but it was incorporated into the British Indian Empire. The difference you can see in color is these yellow territories were self-governed, but anything in pink was ruled entirely by the British, no local control. So as you can see, the entire country of Myanmar was controlled by the British, and there still exists a very heavy British influence in architecture and also kind of the way people interact. They gained their independence, though, in 1948, largely due to this man, Aung San Suu Kyi. But unfortunately, though, he passed away 6 months before independence was achieved due to an assassination attempt. But he's still regarded as a national hero, almost the equivalent of our George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Until the 1980s, his face was in all the money, and his picture is still plastered around the country. They maintained their independence until 1962, when unfortunately, these guys, the military junta, took over in what amounted to a bloodless coup d'etat. For the next approximately 50 years, they instituted what was known as the Myanmar Social Initiative, which combined socialism with mysticism. They used mysticism to justify what they were doing, but they had this goal of creating a socialism paradise, which really never really panned out and led them to get the award of least developed country in the world by the UN. So they decided to move the capital from Yangon, which had been historically for hundreds of years, to Nalpadi, which literally translates to City of Kings, to show their power and that they could control anything in the country and get what they wanted. They decided, though, in 2011 to dissolve, largely from a lot of international pressure, and really take a chance to step back because they really just felt that they weren't having any sort of power and obviously did not want to be executed. So what this leaves us now is a current situation. Here's the parliament now in Nalpadi where most of the government decisions are made. It's really heavily influenced by 2 protests. One is in 1988, which is called 8888 for August 8, 1988, which was when the students of Yangon University first rose up against the government, and it's still a very sensitive subject. And then also 2007 was when the monks decided they were upset about the oil prices, so that's when Myanmar was really on the news for killing their own people because it was such a public action. But now they've had a sort of paradigm shift and almost pursuing a strategy similar to China, where it's be very pro-business and have come one, come all, largely to try to change what's been going on here. So now they're also having a problem though with civil wars because it was combined and forced together a lot of people who didn't get along. They have what amount to refugees from Bangladesh who they consider themselves citizens of the country, but the government doesn't because they're Muslim, as where most Myanmar citizens are Buddhist. And also they have the Kachan like population, which kind of drifts between Thailand and Myanmar. And so these two issues really are major instability, destabilizing factors in the country. So who's looking to get into Myanmar? Right now, it's a lot of oil companies, so BP, Gazprom, and then the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation. But Coke has actually made a lot of news recently because for the first time in 56 years, their products are now being sold once again in the country. And so it really just shows how international they are and Myanmar's attempts to open back up. And another main benefit to this country is Myanmar's foreign investment law. And what this law is it really changes the idea of having a joint venture. You can lease land for 50 years, which normally in other countries is 10 to 20. But here you have a long-term lease that can almost be renewed indefinitely. You also have the negotiation of ownership for a joint venture. In China, for example, there's certain industries that are really restricted on what you can and can't do. But here there's really no limit. If you wanted 80, 90% of a company, it's very possible as long as they agree to it. No nationalization. They've made a really big push to open back up, to no longer be a dictatorship, and this is a proof about how they're making commitment to companies that if you invest in our country, we'll return that favor in kind. And also they have tax relief and tax holiday, and so as I said, if you're investing in the country, they're not going to take your money, and it's more, their bigger concern is getting people employed. They have an initiative where, to start with, you only need 25% of your working force to be Myanmar citizens, but eventually they'd like to see that be 75%. Now, some of the problems with the law. There's really no clarity on what's restricted. One of the big advantages it has is it's right in between China and India, and so it was originally Asia's breadbasket, but there's this huge unknown regarding what people can invest in with regards to agriculture and fisheries, and there's no really anyone telling them what you can invest with, and obviously no one wants their money taken. And it's also largely due to the Myanmar Investment Commission, which is kind of the overruling body, not exactly clarifying what you can and can't get involved with. Another major problem is the overuse of tax holidays. There was one article that talked about there's companies in Myanmar that are Myanmarese that really want to invest back in their country, but these tax holidays almost hurt the country because the government's saying we don't want your money. So there's really no way to develop public infrastructure. So what are these companies looking for? The main thing is obviously oil. This is the most important resource arguably in the world, second to water. It's pretty much in everything that we use. If there was potential to go in, obviously people would go in full force, but there's a huge discrepancy on what exists. Some people say it's the next Middle East, other people saying there's only enough oil to power the US for a year, so obviously depending on how much is there, is going to influence how much money people invest. The next thing is teak wood. 75% of teak wood, whether for your door frames, really big thing in India, and also just a domestic industry that they already export. But the question is going to be is, can they balance that being a sustainable industry and avoid the problems that China did when they ramped up their country and almost destroyed it in the process? The next thing is precious stone and sapphires. They produce 80% of the world's sapphires and rubies. The one problem though is a lot of the major auction houses don't want to buy it because there's a huge connection with child labor, and no one really wants to be caught in that political storm. And finally is minerals of tungsten and iron. Having more and more minerals, people are constantly looking with China to keep expanding. This just represents another opportunity, but there's a lot of uncertainty once again about the safety of these mines and really how stable they are. So some more of the challenges. There's very little infrastructure. There's pretty much 3 main highways that don't really converge except to go into Yangon. So if you're trying to go into these remote regions where resources can exist, there's really nothing there other than dirt roads. So it makes infrastructure, transportation, bringing materials there next to impossible. Another issue is rampant corruption. Being in a junta and dictatorship, obviously you do what you can to survive, but now it's the question of how do you transition from that dog-eat-dog world into something more sustainable in the long term. Next is human rights abuses. A big issue was both children and political prisoners basically being exploited to traffic heroin and also to work in these mines for free. And companies don't really want to encounter a situation they encountered in the Philippines, Indonesia, when they found out they had child labor. So what is worth pursuing? Some of the good things, obviously, precious stone and teak. It's a very established industry, and it's really only more needs investment to keep expanding. The big uncertainty is oil, because there's never been a major substantial push to look for it, because it obviously requires a lot of technology, but now with opening up, there's something that could be developed there going forward. And finally, what's probably not worth pursuing, these minerals, pretty much almost weekly they have earthquakes that destroy their mines, or they're in these civil war regions. So right now, they're probably worth avoiding. So my recommendations are twofold. The first is you need first-hand experience of the area. This is very much a closed society that really hasn't been open to anything beyond the sort of backpacking tourist who's just going there to say that, oh, I've been there. And second is hold off on investment for now. There's definitely opportunities in that country, but it's not worth pursuing until you know exactly what you're going for. With that, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Are any of the civil wars going to be resolved?
I would say that it's very possible. One of the things that's really changed is the president has come out and said that he's now considering recognizing these people. For the longest time, he said they were illegal refugees or illegal immigrants that needed to be dispelled. But now, due to international pressure, he's open to that proposal. And I think that if they were granted citizenship, those issues would resolve themselves. Yes.
What will China's role be in Myanmar?
I think China's role is going to be very similar to the role in Africa, in the sense that they're really just there to take all they can. They're not really concerned with developing the country. And so I think that's kind of a sad situation, and that's actually why the president canceled their major hydroelectric project in the country, is they felt that it was very one-sided and that all China was trying to do is come and exploit all their resources for their advantage. Yes.
After President Obama's visit to Myanmar, where would you say we stand politically with the country?
I would say that we stand a lot better than we did before. I think there's a huge interest going forward. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Canadian Prime Minister, a lot of more world leaders are looking to get there, and I think that's only going to help U.S. relations and having another partner in the region, because obviously we're trying to get more involved in ASEAN, which is the major governing body for that region. And so I think having that relationship with Myanmar would be really beneficial. Yes?
You briefly mentioned Myanmar's kind of Mother Teresa. Was it Aung San?
Aung San Suu Kyi, yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about her?
Okay, so basically what she did is, her father's Aung San, who's a national hero, and she sort of got involved in government and was really making this huge push toward democracy. And then around when 1988 happened, was really the leading force of, I want something different, like I want my people to have freedom. And so the government was like, okay, we'll try to make this work, and had elections. And her party actually won 98% of the election. And so they threw out the election and said that it was rigged, and placed her under house arrest for about 15 years. They wouldn't let her leave. Her husband actually died during that time. They wouldn't let her leave the country to go back to England to see him. So it was this really trying time for her. And the people of the country really respected that she put the interests of everyone else, even people she didn't even know, above her own family, because she recognized how important Myanmar being a safe place for people was.
Is she still active?
Yeah, she's very much still active, and she kind of comes and goes whether she supports the government. In some sense, she still said it's another reiteration of the military, because a lot of the leaders of the government are ex-military people, but she recognized it's like steps to get to the right direction. And another thing she's worried about is all this rapid foreign investment is going to actually set them back, because they're just going to be exploited. And so she's really the main stabilizing factor in trying to balance development, but also sort of maintain the identity. Yes.
Yeah, coming off this drastic change in the rule, do you think Myanmar's government is going to be able to carry out public works projects like this?
I would say there's potential. I think that before, obviously not. So really the main concern was exploiting as much as you can. But now they recognize the need that they're not going to attract investment if there's no roads, if there's no waterways. Another issue you have right now is you have to exchange all your currency right when you go into the airport. Otherwise, you have to go to illegal street vendors, which are very questionable whether it's even real money. But they actually just signed a deal with Visa to allow Visa cards into the country, and so that's going to open up a whole nother stream of investment. So it'll really be interesting to see how many people jump on this bandwagon. And they're also hosting an investment conference. And I think the more people they bring in and get a lot of outside dollars, then they have a lot more money to employ people, which is another major issue, is the rapid or massive unemployment. And so I do think it's a possibility. It's just going to be a question of how long it's going to take. Anything else? Well, thank you guys so very much.